So I've been playing a lot of GTA 4 recently. Why? Well, because I intended on making some videos about it at some point, but the only footage I had of it was years old and crusty as shit. So I decided to boot it up on PC to refresh my memory and the footage. Surprisingly, not as unstable as I've been led to believe. There were some issues, there were random, albeit rare frame rate drops, and the graphics got a bit flickery anytime I got into a helicopter, but aside from that, nothing of note. Now, I've been wanting to discuss the revenge plot of Grand Theft Auto 4 for a number of years. Hell, one of my very first videos I had planned was going to be a discussion comparing the revenge plots of Grand Theft Auto 4 and The Last of Us 2, but that was also before I knew what the fuck I was talking about, because much like most people who have an authoritative opinion on The Last of Us Part 2, I hadn't actually played it. Anyways, while I was reacquainting myself with GTA 4 along with everything I liked and disliked about it, something struck me about the plot of Grand Theft Auto 4, because while I still believe it's a great revenge plot, as a matter of fact it's one of my favorites, it also occupies the space of a terrible revenge plot. Hear me out on this. Now, to quantify my opinion, I first have to explain the plot of GTA 4, because I can't assume everyone's played the game. This is a bit of a problem because this is not an easy plot to summarize, but I'll try my best. So the necessary plot begins off screen many years before the events of the game. In an unspecified old country, apparently Yugoslavia, according to the wiki, Niko Bellic was brought up in a harsh environment and ended up being a soldier in the Bosnian Wars, where his platoon of 15 men were sold out and ambushed, leaving only himself and 2 other people alive. At some point, it's not specified when, his cousin Roman moved to America to live out the American dream. Meanwhile, Niko stayed in Europe and fell into a life of crime, particularly as a human trafficker working for a man named Ray Bulgarin. But during one of his smuggling runs, the ship Niko was in charge of got caught, and Ray believed that Niko had intentionally ripped him off, forcing Niko to flee Europe to escape Ray's influence, so he moved to Liberty City so he could be with his cousin Roman. Unfortunately, Roman himself had gotten indebted to the Russian mob in Liberty City, so after some shenanigans, Niko then killed a high-ranking Russian mobster named Vlad, which only put him in hot water with his contemporaries, who were thankfully able to spare him in exchange for doing some work for them. Because apparently Vlad was a dumbass. However, after some happenings, a lower-ranking member of the gang, Dmitry Raskolov, had Niko kill their superior, Mikhail Faustin, only to then reveal that Dmitry was in league with Ray Bulgarin, who was now in Liberty City and wanted his pound of flesh for Niko ostensibly ripping him off.
Mr. Bulgarin?
Yes. Where is our money?
Niko and Roman are forced to flee while everything they own is burnt to a crisp. So long story short, from that point forward, Niko finds himself working for various gangs around the city, both to make money in order to survive and to gain connections in order to track down the other 2 people who survived in his platoon in order to figure out who the culprit of the betrayal was so he can finally get his revenge. That's the central revenge plot. Meanwhile, having to fight against the forces conspiring to take him down, namely Dmitry and the Russian Mafia. So that's about as succinct an explanation as I can give, but there's a lot more story to the game, and a lot of important characters who had to be omitted. At its heart, it's a story about survival against insurmountable odds, and the inability to escape one's past. One of the key themes that this game works with is the idea that there's no happily ever after. No matter what happens, the world continues to turn and we have no choice but to live with the consequences of our own actions and the actions of those around us. The undercurrent of the revenge plot circles around this idea like an electron circles around a nucleus, because Niko claimed that everything that was good about him and was good in his life died the moment the betrayal of his platoon happened and he saw so many of his childhood friends die.
I lost myself that day too. Everything that was good and innocent in me died along with them. If I could live those hours again, I think I would have preferred to be buried in the pit along with everyone else.
The dead don't have to deal with the trauma of everything that's happened. Only those who survive to see the sunrise in the morning do. So as such, Niko's been living with the trauma of that day for every part of a decade. It's destroyed him and was the thing that, as far as we know, set him down the path he's on. And getting revenge against the person who sold their platoon out is the only thing that drives him, because he's hoping that maybe by finishing the story, he can get that happily ever after he's been chasing for so long. Give him a place to start. But despite being one of the core pillars of Nico's character, it's also a plot that never dominates the story, which is good because simply having a chase be the center of a revenge plot can get repetitive in a game like GTA 4, which is a game where it's considered an accomplishment to beat in under 30 hours. There's nothing inherently wrong with a revenge plot, but it's a storytelling tool that doesn't necessarily create a compelling story in itself. What you need is something that sells the story other than that, and because you have the main plot with Nico simply surviving, which takes the form of various compelling subplots, it thankfully means the story never focuses too heavily on revenge as a core pillar and instead brings it up just enough that you never forget about it. The inverse of this would be something like Assassin's Creed 3, which is a painfully repetitive plot about Connor Kenway attempting to take revenge on Charles Lee as the main driving force, which means they have to contrive a reason for Charles Lee to give you the slip for something like 15 hours worth of story. But it also doesn't help that every character in that game except for Haytham Kenway is about as bland as it gets. Where something like GTA 4 doesn't have to worry about that. I would say most, if not all, the characters in GTA 4 are compellingly three-dimensional. Even Dimitri has a method to his madness. Nico is obviously the standout in all of this, having this really compelling detached cynicism brought on by a lifetime of trauma. And he has such a philosophical outlook on life, leading to so many excellent quotable lines.
War is where the young and stupid are tricked by the old and bitter into killing each other. I was very young and very angry.
And despite facing constant betrayal, he has such a sense of loyalty to the people he loves to the point that he would do anything for them. I mean, the reason he even kills Vlad in the first place is because he's sleeping with Roman's girlfriend and Roman refused to do anything about it. But through all the darkness, there's still a little bit of light in Nico's heart. He still has a sense of humor and he wants to find love. He wants to settle down and get away from his criminal past that seems determined to follow him wherever he goes. And then you have the side characters, all much like Nico, humanly flawed characters attempting to make their way through a system in whatever way they can, each with their own positive attributes, flaws, and quirks. I think my favorite is probably Dwayne. Dwayne reminds me a lot of myself in my younger days. And of course there's Kate. Much like the single ray of light in Nico's heart, Kate is the single ray of light in this game's cast of characters. She's essentially the main love interest of the game. She's the lone, well-adjusted person in a family of mobsters, and her brother Packy essentially asks Nico to go out with her because she's a hopeless shut-in. The point is, this game has a lot going for the story, and had a lot of compelling drama to the point that even with a standard plot thread such as a game-wide quest for revenge, it keeps you hooked from start to finish. It doesn't dwell, it keeps you guessing, it finds new ways to keep the intrigue. One of my favorite scenes in the game is when Nico tracks down one of the other survivors, Florian Kravich, now known as Bernie Crane. You get this really dramatic contrast between the two survivors, between the man who's been chasing ghosts for a decade and the man who decided to move on.
Information can be unreliable.
We have to find him. We have to find him.
I think he's a bit freaked out. I guess he thought seeing you would answer some questions.
So I see. Well, it's great to see you guys. We must do brunch!
And what I love about Bernie's character is that despite being the one to have moved on, he still has occasional outbursts where he speaks in his real voice.
Where is Darko?
Dead, I hope! I'm not sure.
So it shows that while Bernie has moved on and has been able to find a new life, he still does carry the same trauma that Nico does. He just decided to express it in a more healthy way, to cope with it rather than let it eat him alive. But with Florian/Bernie being revealed to be innocent, now it's basically confirmed that the last surviving member, Darko Brevic, was the culprit. And when you finally do get that confrontation with Darko Brevic in the end, after finally pulling enough favors to basically have him kidnapped from Europe and brought over, this scene recontextualizes the entire game's narrative. Naturally, throughout the game, we're on Nico's side because we have an inherent connection with him given that he's the character we're playing as. If you're at all immersed in the game, his motivations are our motivations. You're going through the entire game with the same mindset as Nico that this Darko guy deserves what's coming to him. He's an undeniable bastard of a character and we want to see him die in order to get closure on the story arc that we've been taken on. But then this scene finally comes and it plays out as you would expect.
I'm the one who survived.
Darko essentially sold his platoon out for drug money because he's an absolute junkie, but then there's this one line that's always stuck with me because, like I said, it intelligently recontextualizes the entire revenge plot.
You killed my friends for $1,000.
How much do you charge to kill someone?
And he is right. When you really think about it, through this entire story, during this entire quest for revenge, Nico has done a lot of things that one could argue is just as bad if not worse than what Darko did, and a lot of times for less reason. He killed and betrayed people because he was instructed to, he killed people to cover his own ass, he robbed people, he kidnapped someone. At one point he was complicit in the murder of 2 people and willingly drove their cadavers to a black market organ donor to be sold. All because the 2 people in question were a bit annoying. Hell, at one point, he willingly killed one of the McCreary brothers, it's up to the player to decide which one, then conveniently spends the rest of the game omitting the fact that he was responsible. So when it all comes back to this moment, gun drawn against the person who he's been searching for 10 years, protagonist be damned, you can't really deny that Darko has a point. At that point, it's driven home further by one of the random lines that Darko says.
You say I ruined you? You were always a killer. I just helped you see that.
And can you really say that he's wrong? I guess we don't necessarily know because we didn't know Nico during the war, but we do know that he committed a lot of heinous acts during the war. He said so himself.
When the war came, I did bad things. And after the war, I thought nothing of doing bad things.
So who's to say he wouldn't have gone down the exact same road? The point being that by this point, Nico has committed so many horrific story mandatory acts that he can't claim the moral high ground against Darko. With a single sentence, I honestly can no longer say I'm fully on Nico's side. I'm not sure if he deserves this revenge or if Darko truly deserves to die, because what right do we have in saying that he's done something unforgivable when we've done plenty of unforgivable things to plenty of people? But then I think the best part of this revenge plot is the choice, because with this being a sandbox game, player choice is pretty much the #1 priority. Throughout the game, you're given the choice to either kill or spare various people. And I have a sneaking suspicion that that mechanic was only put in for this one particular moment. You're given the choice to either take revenge or walk away. And regardless of which one you pick, nothing really changes. Either way, Nico was left feeling equally empty and unfulfilled. In the scenario where you finally kill him, his hopes of being able to finally get closure on his trauma and move on with his life are dashed as reality sets in.
The emptiness is what I was trying to get rid of by finding Darko. I've been empty ever since that day. I thought that revenge, killing Darko, might fill me up a bit, might give me some substance.
And it hasn't?
No, it hasn't.
Meanwhile, if he spares Darko, it's established that he realized that killing him would not bring closure, and that it would only end Darko's story while Nico's story would go on.
Living is not easy. No, I would live to killing Darko as well. But then when I looked at him, I realized that nothing would change if I killed him. Revenge would not somehow shut the book on what I have seen.
No matter what, Nico still has to live with his past, so either way, Nico reaches the same conclusion from opposite ends of the spectrum. That it was essentially all for nothing, everything he held onto for so long, everything that drove him led to a dead end. What he thought he wanted for so long didn't matter in the end, and there's no storybook ending for us to achieve. The only way to get closure is to move on. Personally, while neither decision affects the end game, I think the more narratively satisfying choice is to spare Darko. Because it kind of disproves what Nico said during the mission, the idea that everything that was good about him died the day his platoon was betrayed. Despite everything, it shows that there's still a glimmer of the old Nico Bellic in there somewhere. He has potential to be better. With that said, however, I do think that the story stumbles a bit after this. That revenge plot is sublime. It's the game's other revenge plot that's kind of terrible. Okay, terrible may be a stretch, but it's not great. The main plot of the game comes to a head pretty much immediately after your decision to either kill or spare Darko, and the conclusion to that plot kind of inadvertently undoes the profoundness of that subplot by basically turning around and rewarding the player for believing that revenge is awesome, actually. You see, in the penultimate mission, your main contact, the leader of a smaller mafia family named Jimmy Pecorino, basically gives you an ultimatum to work with Dmitry Raskolov again, the guy who betrayed you at the end of the first act. It's a mutually beneficial partnership that will make you a ton of money and make the Pecorino family powerful again. However, you're also given the choice to say screw the deal and get revenge on Dmitry. Roman wants you to take the deal, however, Kate believes that you shouldn't, and the choice you make will change the ending of the game. Getting revenge leads to Kate dying, and Jimmy Pecorino being the main antagonist of the final mission, and taking the deal results in Roman dying and Dmitry being the antagonist of the final mission. I'm gonna say something that's probably gonna be unpopular. It makes more sense for Nico to take the deal and should in theory be the more narratively satisfying choice. But despite being what I believe should be the more narratively satisfying story path, it leads to the worse ending. As a matter of fact, I think the ending where you take the deal and where Roman dies is kind of shit. Because here's the thing, Dmitry should have been the antagonist at the end of the game. He should have been the final boss, so to speak, because he was the lead antagonist for the entire game. Having Jimmy Pecorino as the final villain in the last mission is kind of lame because he was only introduced in the third act. So killing off the main antagonist in the penultimate mission only to have the final boss be a much less compelling villain leads to a bit of an anticlimax of an otherwise great story. Plus, I believe that in the context of Nico being given the choice to either go back on his principles and work with Dmitry one more time or take his revenge against Dmitry, I actually think it makes more sense within the narrative construct for him to decide to work with Dmitry, because he had literally just the mission before gone through the Darko Brevic conclusion, where he realizes that revenge didn't bring him closure. So off the back of that decision, he probably would have been willing to work with Dmitry one more time. Otherwise, it's just plainly inconsistent characterization. He shouldn't trust Dmitry, that's a given, but based on what had just happened, you can't tell me that this isn't something that Nico wouldn't at least think about. Especially for the money, because he's been going on and on about the money the entire game. It makes sense that in a moment of weakness, he ultimately screws himself by choosing to work with someone he shouldn't have worked with, leading to the death of someone close to him. To me, it just makes more sense for Nico's character, because he's not a good guy. He's an anti-hero at best. Plus, if you ask me, it also makes the final mission make more narrative sense, because after Nico does the deal, Dmitry is left a very powerful man. While Nico thought that going through with the deal would mean Dmitry would leave him alone because in theory they're all square, Dmitry still sends an assassin after Nico, and despite the first assassin failing and only succeeding in killing Roman in the crossfire, Dmitry is a liability to leave alive because he's obviously gonna go after Nico again. So while you could make the argument that revenge is part of the plan in the decision to go after Dmitry at this point, there's deeper substance. Nico is trying to protect himself, or at least that's an argument that can be made. Whereas it's well established that Pecorino is basically finished after the deal falls through if Nico decides to take revenge. Fuck off, AVG. His mafia family has fallen apart, and the only people who will work for him are two-bit gangsters in it for the money. At that point, he's going after Pecorino for revenge for Kate, and not much else. Sure, Pecorino could also be a liability in theory, but a broke mobster is not the same liability as a rich and powerful one. Nico had earned the ire of many mobsters that were in a better position than Pecorino at this point and lived to tell the tale. So if you ask me, it's at least mostly about revenge at this point, which once again goes against Nico's character arc that was already taken to a close. It's a 2-for-1 character incongruity special. So yes, for the more consistent story arc and the fact that Dmitry should have been the final boss, I believe that in principle, the story arc where you take the deal and work with Dmitry makes more sense. However, like I brought up earlier, the problem is the ending it leads to is absolutely dreadful. Like, I'm all for a nihilistic ending, but it feels like this mission path's ending is so nihilistic it's almost insulting. Once it's all said and done and Dmitry is finally dead, Kate promises to be there for Nico while he's grieving Roman. Makes sense, that's something you do for someone you care about, but then after only a few in-game days, she basically calls you up and breaks up with you, saying that she can't deal with living on the periphery of gang life and she doesn't want to raise kids without a father. Incidentally, I never got this call for some reason, but it implies that she liked Nico as more than a friend, but she knew that he was gonna fall back into the life of crime no matter what. So she opts to break up with him and leave the city. If you ask me, there's no silver lining to this ending, leaving Nico completely alone, and that's just upsetting. Whereas in the mission path where you decide to take revenge on Dmitri, you still have Roman, and as a matter of fact, Roman tells you that Mallory, his now wife, is pregnant. And if it's a girl, they will name her Kate in her honor. It's still a depressing ending, but I would consider it satisfyingly depressing, where there's enough of a silver lining that it leaves you with a little bit of hope, something the other ending has none of. Plus, I'm just gonna throw this out there, I think that it really doesn't make sense that Kate would decide not to go to the wedding just because Nico took the deal. Yeah, that's the narrative justification for her not dying in the story path where you take the deal. She apparently doesn't respect Nico for going through with it, but she doesn't even know the nature of the deal, like, at all. All Nico tells her is that Nico is going back on his principles for money. Why is that enough for her to decide not to go to the wedding? And just think about how many people we had to kill just to get to Dmitri. I'm sure if she knew that, she also wouldn't have respected his decision. Personally, if it were my decision, I would have switched the two paths. I would have had Kate die in the deal ending and have Roman die in the revenge ending. I also would have had it so Kate doesn't abandon you in the ending where she survives. I think if they did this, it would make for a more balanced couple of endings because they're obviously trying to present it as though there's no true correct answer, but there absolutely is. But if you did this, you theoretically couldn't call one better than the other objectively. And more importantly, it makes what I think is the more logical ending not feel like such a non-standard game over. Or alternatively, I would have had the game give you a third option. Walk away. Don't take the deal. Don't take revenge. Just walk away and let the chips fall where they may. I don't know what the compromise would have been for that story path, but if you ask me, that's the most logical thing for Nico to have done at that point. That way he doesn't betray his principles by working with Dmitri, but he also doesn't go back on his character arc. So that's why I think Grand Theft Auto 4 is simultaneously a fantastic and terrible revenge story. The plot with Darko Brevic is perfect and makes total sense, but then the rest of the plot and the entire game-ending scenario undermines everything that subplot achieved. I still think the story is great, don't get me wrong, filled with great characters, believable dialogue, compelling drama, and everything else you could want out of a good story, and I will fully admit that I'm in the minority in my opinions. I guarantee the amount of people who took the deal or think the deal ending should be the better ending is in a vast minority to the people who decided on revenge. Because while we do have that connection with Nico, we're not living through Nico's character arc. There's a tendency for people to call it bad screenwriting when a character makes a bad choice, and I think that while that can be true to a point because it's entirely possible to have a character make a choice that's completely illogical and no human would ever make, but characters miscalculating and making a mistake is not bad screenwriting objectively because that would assume that every person ever will always 100% of the time make the absolute A1 objective correct decision in every situation, which simply isn't true. Humans aren't infallible. So while characters may make decisions that we think they shouldn't make, that's easy for us to say because we aren't in their shoes. We're not experiencing what they're experiencing, but there I go on a complete tangent again. So I suppose it's time to wrap this up. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here.
Sound shaking, earthquaking, change.
And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Ty Trovy, Weird Webster, and Monsieur Thenardier for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.